So I would say the biggest thing to look out for in China over the next 5 years is the way China is becoming an amazingly complex and diverse and exciting society, and whether the political system will be able to manage that diversity effectively and productively. I think a lot of Americans expected that China would come to have a political system that was a lot more like our political system, and that was a reason for engaging with China. That turns out to have been wrong. It has not, 30, 40 years of reform and opening up in China has not led to a kind of convergence with a kind of universal system of government. The question now, of course, is whether the Chinese system will be able to accommodate demands for participation, demands for accountability, demands for transparency, without the dramatic kind of structural transformation that previous generations of China watchers were looking for and expecting. If you've been following China, as I have for now more than 3 decades, it's been really striking that people kept expecting there to be a tipping point at which China would have to move to a different kind of political system. So first it was reform of and opening up, then it was the emergence of the middle class. If they didn't change the political system to accommodate the demands of the middle class, they'd be finished. Then it was the financial sector, right? You couldn't have a modern banking system, you couldn't have a modern financially driven economy without political reform. That turned out to be wrong. It's amazing now to see that China is becoming a world leader in certain areas of high tech, in AI, in robotics, and so on. No one would have expected that you could have a Silicon Valley in China under an authoritarian political system. I have just spent the last week in Zhongguancun in northwestern Beijing, which is very much like the Silicon Valley of China. And it turns out that you can have AI without political reform. So I think we keep pushing further and further away the moment when China must absolutely political reform, and eventually probably people are going to give up on that. The issue of Taiwan is really interesting because Taiwan is a fabulous counterexample to those who would say that Chinese culture is not suited to democracy. It's one of Taiwanese should be enormously proud of the very vibrant democracy that they've constructed, the very vibrant civil society they've constructed. It has to be remembered, though, that Jiang Jingguo launched that democratization campaign largely for international reasons. He knew that he would not be able to maintain global support, and in particular American support, for an authoritarian regime. And so the impetus for democratization in Taiwan was complex, and it did have something to do with the demands of a rising middle class, but it also had something to do with political decisions at the top. Will there be a political decision like that at the top in China? Xi Jinping has told us explicitly and repeatedly, no. Well, there's an extraordinary counterpoint between Xi's remarks at Davos and Trump's remarks at the United Nations, and those two speeches are if you just read the transcripts of those speeches, you would be amazed to think this one came from a Chinese leader and this one came from an American leader. But that's the world that we're in. I think there are big challenges on the road to China's global leadership. As I mentioned in my remarks at the Next China Conference, China has to step up in all kinds of ways in which it never has had to step up. And China did very, very well by, for example, not taking a position on Middle East peace. But if China is going to be a global leader, it's going to have to contribute to the Middle East peace, to the peace process in the Middle East. So, to me, it's not a done deal. China is not going to be a global leader because Xi Jinping said China will become a global leader. That's obviously his intention. Do they have the capabilities? Do they have the willingness to bear the costs? Do they have the complex thinking to develop a global leadership strategy? These are unanswered questions. Well, North Korea is really the big unanswered question. I think, in a sense, there's no more pressing issue in global affairs right now than North Korea. If the U.S. if the U.S. and China can work together on North Korea, that bodes enormously well for I think the future of the globe of the world. One of the things that's going to make that difficult is that China will have to balance interests that it's never had to balance before. It will also have to trust the United States that if the Korean Peninsula can be denuclearized, the U.S. will not seek regime change in the North. And the reality is that the U.S. does not like the regime in the North, and the U.S. has sought regime change in lots of places where it didn't like the regime. So there's a whole level of trust that needs to be accomplished before the two sides can work together. Your other question about whether China is going to be more aggressive, we're already, of course, seeing that. We're seeing that in particular in the South China Sea, but we're seeing other evidence of that elsewhere. I think one of the big questions that China is going to need to figure out is whether it is willing to sacrifice what it sees as important national interests for the sake of its global reputation. I don't think we've seen that yet. And if China doesn't make that trade-off, then its moves are going to be seen as more aggressive. The other element of this is the soft power slash sharp power moves. These are enormously counterproductive. Soft power is productive, but so far has not been terribly effective. That is to say, China is not presenting to the world a set of values, a set of ideas that lots of people around the world find particularly compelling, except perhaps in the economic realm. So soft power is kind of acceptable to the global community, but so far not very effective. Sharp power is totally counterproductive. All it does is alienate China from people who would otherwise be neutral.